On August 14th, 1958, Elvis Presley walked into a stonemason's workshop in Memphis. He was 23, the most famous man on the planet, and he'd just lost his mother. He gave the mason one instruction nobody expected: put a Star of David on her headstone, right next to the cross. The mason hesitated. The Presleys were Pentecostal, Assembly of God, the kind of Southern Christian where speaking in tongues is a Tuesday. A Star of David on a Christian woman's grave in 1958 Mississippi? That wasn't a small thing. That was the kind of choice that ends careers in the South. But Elvis didn't budge. He paid for it. He stood there while it was carved, and for the rest of his life, he wore a small gold pendant under his shirt with the Hebrew word for life on it, Chai. Most fans never noticed. Most biographers didn't ask. And the official story, the one Graceland still tells, is that Elvis had Cherokee blood through some great-great-great-grandmother named Mourning Dove White. That story is wrong. I want to be careful here, because this is the kind of topic where rumors fly and DNA gets used as a weapon. So let's slow down. The Cherokee story didn't come out of nowhere. Elvis's mother Gladys mentioned it. Aunts and cousins repeated it. By the time Elvis hit the army, he was telling reporters he was part Indian on his mother's side. The original source was a woman in the family tree named Mourning Dove White, allegedly born around 1800, allegedly full-blooded Cherokee, allegedly married to a man named William Mansell, who fought under Andrew Jackson at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. It's a beautiful story. It places Elvis at a meaningful intersection of American history. The problem is, Mourning Dove White doesn't exist in any tribal record. Not in the Dawes rolls, not in the Baker roll, not in the Cherokee census of 1835. There's no marriage certificate, no baptism, no grave. She is, as far as the actual paper trail goes, a ghost. Now that alone doesn't disprove anything. Plenty of indigenous ancestors were left out of those rolls on purpose. Cherokee identity in the 1800s was dangerous, and many families hid it. So genealogists kept digging, and what they found in the Mansell-Smith-Presley line wasn't a Cherokee woman at all. It was a woman named Nancy J. Burdine. Nancy was Elvis's great-great-grandmother. She married a man called White Mansell, and that's likely where the White in Mourning Dove White came from. A misremembered surname turned into a romantic invention. Nancy Burdine wasn't Cherokee. Documentation of her parents, Abner Burdine and Sarah Tackett, places the family in a tight cluster of Sephardic Jewish settlers who came through the Carolinas in the late 1700s, descendants of Iberian Jews who'd fled the Inquisition 2 centuries earlier and converted publicly while keeping their identity quietly inside the family. That's the line that ran straight down to Gladys Love Smith, straight down to Elvis. And here's where modern DNA enters the story, because we don't have to take the genealogist's word for it. In the 2000s and 2010s, several of Elvis's documented blood relatives, including descendants on the Smith side, submitted to commercial autosomal DNA testing. The results, when run against reference panels, showed 2 things consistently. First, no detectable Native American ancestry. None. Below the noise floor of the test. The Cherokee story, at the genetic level, just isn't there. Second, small but unmistakable Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jewish markers, concentrated in the segments inherited from the Smith-Mansell-Burdine line. Now I want you to hear me clearly. We're not talking about Elvis being half Jewish or secretly Jewish in some sensationalist sense. We're talking about an ancestor, probably 4 to 6 generations back, being Jewish, with that DNA quietly passed down. It's small, but it's real, and Elvis seems to have known. Here's what I find genuinely fascinating at this, and I've spent enough time around genetic genealogy to know how rare this is. Most Americans with deep colonial ancestry have stories like Elvis's Cherokee, a romanticized indigenous great-grandmother, a high cheekbones explanation. It's almost a national folk myth. What's unusual about Elvis isn't the wrong story. It's that someone in his family quietly preserved the right one. Gladys, his mother, knew something. We can infer this because of what she passed to him in private. Elvis kept a Star of David on his mother's grave. He kept a mezuzah on the doorframe of his Memphis bedroom, not Graceland, his earlier home on Audubon Drive. Multiple visitors documented it. He wore the Chai pendant. He sometimes signed letters to friends with a small Star of David instead of a kiss. None of this was for the cameras. None of it ended up in the press releases. This was personal, inherited, quiet. To understand why it stayed quiet, you have to understand the Memphis of Elvis's childhood. The Presleys were dirt poor, white, Southern Pentecostal. And in that exact world in the 1930s and 40s, being identified as Jewish wasn't just unfashionable, it was economically dangerous. Restrictive housing covenants in the South often barred Jews. So did country clubs, hotels, certain neighborhoods. There's a reason Sephardic families who'd been in America since 1750 sometimes went 4 generations without telling their children. Not shame, protection. The technical name for these families is crypto-Jews or conversos, descendants of forced converts who kept the practice alive in fragments, lighting candles on Friday night and calling it a Smith family tradition, refusing to mix meat and milk and calling it a delicate stomach, burying the dead within a day and calling it the country. Across generations, the meaning is forgotten, the behavior persists. And the Smith family did some of these things. Elvis Presley, Elvis's uncle, mentioned in his memoir that Gladys was particular about food in ways nobody quite understood. She avoided pork in certain combinations. She lit candles on Friday nights and dismissed it as just a thing my mother did. She insisted her grandmother and great-grandmother had all done the same. Now, I want to be honest. None of that, on its own, is proof. Plenty of Southern Christians lit candles. Plenty avoided pork mixes. But put it next to the documented Burdine line, the Sephardic settler cluster in the Carolinas, the DNA results, the Star of David Elvis insisted on, the mezuzah on his door, the shy necklace under his shirt, and a pattern emerges that's hard to explain any other way. Something was being passed down. Something was remembered, even when the words for it were lost. Elvis seems to have been the first one in his line to recognize it for what it was. And he did recognize it. In 1957, a year before his mother died, Elvis met a man named Rabbi Alfred Fruchter. The Fruchters lived above the Presleys in their Memphis apartment when Elvis was a teenager. The rabbi's wife, Jeanette, later said Elvis would come up on Friday evenings and turn on their lights for them after sunset. He was their Shabbos Goy, the non-Jewish neighbor who handles things observant Jews can't on the Sabbath. But Jeanette said something else interesting. She said Elvis didn't ask why they couldn't turn on the lights. He already knew. He'd ask quiet questions about the prayers, about the candles, about the mezuzah by their door. The Fruchters never converted him, never claimed him. They were, by their own account, a little baffled. Here was this poor Southern Christian kid who already seemed to know things he shouldn't. Years later, when Elvis bought the Shy pendant, he told a friend, "I don't want to miss out on heaven on a technicality." That line gets quoted as a joke. I don't think it was a joke. I think it was the most honest thing Elvis ever said about his identity. He grew up in a faith that taught the Jews were God's first chosen people. He found out in fragments that he might be one of them, not in any halachic official rabbinical sense, but in some older, quieter sense that ran through his mother's blood. And he hedged. He kept the cross. He kept the Pentecostal upbringing. He kept the gospel records. And remember, Elvis won 3 Grammys in his career, all of them for gospel, none for rock and roll. But he also kept the chai. He put the Star of David on his mother's grave. He wouldn't let go of either side. There's a kind of theological honesty in it. He didn't know which tradition was true. He didn't know which one his mother's mother had practiced in private. So he held both. Until the day he died, he held both. After Elvis's death in 1977, the Star of David on Gladys's headstone became a problem for Graceland. Tour groups asked about it. Some asked uncomfortably. The decision was made, quietly by the estate, to move Gladys's body to the meditation garden behind the mansion, alongside Elvis. Her original headstone, with both symbols, was preserved separately. The new memorial features only Christian iconography. If you visit Graceland today, you'll see no Star of David. You'll see no mezuzah. The official biography mentions Cherokee ancestry, not Sephardic. The chai pendant Elvis wore is in storage, rarely displayed. There's nothing sinister in any of this. Graceland is a business, and businesses simplify. But it does mean that the version of Elvis most fans know is missing a piece, a small, quiet piece. The piece his mother passed him in candlelight. The piece he tried, in his clumsy and earnest way, to honor without anyone making a fuss. What I find moving about this, and I've studied a lot of family genetic history, is how ordinary the story actually is. Millions of Americans are walking around with small percentages of ancestry they don't know about. African ancestors who got reclassified as white in the 1700s, indigenous grandmothers whose tribes erased them, Jewish great-great-grandfathers who became Methodists in Charleston in 1820. The DNA persists. The stories don't. What made Elvis unusual wasn't the genetics. Sephardic ancestry through the Carolinas is genuinely common, more common than people realize. What made him unusual was that he listened. When his mother lit candles and couldn't say why, he noticed. When the rabbi upstairs said prayers in a language he didn't know, he stayed and learned. When the time came to put a symbol on his mother's grave, He chose the one that matched the silence she'd kept. There's a lesson in this that has nothing to do with Elvis. Most of us have ancestors we'll never meet, who made decisions we'll never understand, who hid things to keep their children alive. Some of those decisions worked. The children survived. Some of them cost us pieces of ourselves we're still trying to find in DNA results and old census records and weird family habits nobody can explain. Elvis got lucky. He found his peace, even if he found it sideways. He honored it the only way he knew how, privately, imperfectly, with a star next to a cross and a small gold necklace under his stage costume. We don't have to romanticize it. We don't have to claim him for any tradition he didn't claim for himself. But the next time you see a photo of Elvis on stage in that white jumpsuit, look closely at the chain around his neck. There's a small pendant on it, the Hebrew word for life. He never took it off, and now you know why.